Party people, Tony Rowe signing in. One hell of a game today in the Cannabis tournament. I could not make a video about it. I watched it at work, and then I had a late day at work. I rushed home. I got some takeout sushi, and I made some annotations. So let's go through it. If you have not been paying attention, Caruana had a really wonderful game against MVL today. And right out of the gate, Sicilian Najdorf, not super surprising given MVL's taste for the opening. And, sort of also not surprising in a way that it was a poison pawn. Like, Fabiano's been, under a rock. Not been doing any of the online stuff that all the other guys have been doing. Just dark. You look at his Twitter, he hasn't tweeted since January. He's in the dark. Okay, and then they go into this poison pawn, and I don't know how many new people I really have watching my videos. I sort of have a dedicated 14 people that watch, but this is a variation that at least became famous, I think, in the Fischer Spassky matches in the 1970s that got that first wave of American players really playing. I think it was games 7 and 11. And, white goes queen d2 in this position, offers up the b pawn if the black queen wants to grab it, of course. Then nowadays, everyone goes rook b1. They grab this free tempo, and this queen on a3 is on the sideline. So white has this big lead in development, 3 minor pieces, this rook, and we'll try and castle quickly and bust black open. Meanwhile, black's hoping that his more solid compact structure in that pawn is going to tell long term, but he's going to have to survive quite the storm to make it work. So, I think in the Fischer Spassky match, at least one of the games went knight b3 instead, but not super important. It's also possible here, I put this in the notes, I'm probably not going to go through all of the annotations that I made just to try and keep this video reasonably short, but it is also possible, same idea, to go queen d3 instead. And then queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3, and there are some cool subtleties here that I think are interesting to at least talk about for a second. The first one is that the queen on a3 actually kind of pseudo-pins this knight because white's down a pawn. You don't really want to move the knight and trade queens. But the queen on d3 also allows the queen to swing along this third rank. For instance, in the main line, f5, bishop e7. Black just is developing. White's trying to open up the game. Takes, bishop e2, queen a5. Hitting the bishop, pinning the knight. Bishop d2. Probably with some nasty threats knight d5, etc. Black moves the queen. g4, interesting. Planning g5. h6, and then queen a3. Queen h3, excuse me. Again, renewing the threat of this g5 because of the pin along the h-file. But yeah, queen d3 is interesting but less common than queen d2. So queen takes b2. Queen a3, this is how the game continued, and then this e5 move. And this is historically, I would say, the main move, even back to some tall games. And Korchnoi Toulouche, I think, was one of the early games. And black goes h6. I think it's also possible to play d takes e5 here, f takes e5, and then h6 here, or to go knight f to d7, knight e4, and then h6 here. But there's pretty concrete evidence nowadays that you must go h6 at some point. It's actually in doing these annotations, it was actually very hard for me to at least quickly ascertain why that's the case. There is one humorous difference. I'll try and recreate it here if I can. But if you don't go h6, you kind of get curb stomped a little bit. So just kind of following similar lines to the game, knight e4. Again, this would be a difference between queen d2 and queen d3. With the queen on d3, you can't go knight e4 here because queen takes d3 would be good. Also, with the queen on d3, knight takes e5 would hit the queen with tempo, and taking the queen would also be checked, so it's a very serious threat. Yeah, and again, these lines will parallel the lines in the game. So with the knight leaving the c3 square, black is free to again gobble up one more pawn, hitting the rook d1, centralizing the rook, and then re-centralizing the queen and hitting this knight on e4 at the same time. So black's trying to like get his queen out of danger, consolidate a bit. White protects with, and also exposes the queen along the d file with queen to e3. And then there are two different moves black has tried to not die here. And the first would be queen takes e5. Yeah, we can go over this one first. Bishop e2, just simple development. Bishop c5. Knight takes c5, not advisable because of queen takes e3. Bishop takes e3. Knight takes c5 when white is unsuccessfully traded queens. Castles. Bishop f4. Queen d5, c4. And actually, the whole point of this queen d5, bishop f4, queen d5, c4 operation is that the only square that the black queen has is c6, which is kind of humorous, right? Using this pin. This is actually one of my correspondence games from 2010, in which I found a very cute move, bishop d6. Hitting the rook on f8, of course, and also with the very simple idea of unpinning the knight. And I won this game. You can look it up. It's A. Rotella. I believe black's name is Andrei Oleksak from 2010. It was an ICCF game. Going back to rook d1 here. There's also bishop c5 immediately not taking on e5. This allows knight takes e6, though. When, like, bishop e3, I believe knight c7 here is good for white. Look into it. We don't have a lot of time here. There is the cute idea of flicking in this bishop check first, and then c3, then taking. Really beautiful idea here. I found I picked out, like, I've cherry picked some variations from the poison pawn just because I think it's like some of the most fascinating chess tactically that you can find, really. There's this gross idea: rook d6, queen a2, bishop e2. Again, white a lot of times, like, white is up so much development and has such a huge conglomerate of pieces on the king side that you can kind of take moves out sometimes to like breathe and then dive back in. But if black gets like hyper greedy and tries to go queen b1 check, white can go king f2, sacking on h1, and then this beautiful idea bishop h6. With kind of like the dual threats of crashing through on g7 in different ways. You can go bishop g7 or queen g5 would be the nasty threats. And yeah, there's the conclusion to this game. It's like between two 2500s in 2016. Yeah, it suffices to say that black lost quickly. Yeah, and so like we'll go back a little bit to maybe why one of the reasons why black needs to insert h6 at some point, but okay, so going all the way back to the game, queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3, e5, h6, bishop h4. I do believe some people tried to make taking on f6 and then going like knight e4 work, but it doesn't. Takes, knight f to g7. I know for a while g5 was also like all the raging correspondence chess. I'm not sure if that like blew up or if it's just like kind of a known drawing line or if MVL wanted something sharper. It could be a lot of things, but okay, similar. And this position kind of like with queen e3 and then queen e5 kind of like blew up again, I think, in like the 2005 2006 sort of era. The first time anyway. This variation has gone through like phases. It was like, I think like Igor Natov played it in like a game in like 2005 and was winning. And then like Timur Rajabov played it in 2006 in 2 games and he beat Anand and Karyakin like in like rapid succession. And then it like kind of exploded. Like all this theory started building up and then it kind of like died back down again when it looked like black had found all the resources. And then again, like within the last couple years, I think with Leela and just more correspondence games, like hundreds of games have now been played from this position. Whereas in like 2005, no one had played this position at all. So it's kind of an interesting theoretical position. But if you check any database, really, that does not include correspondence games, you will see that almost all of the games in this position have either started with bishop g3 or bishop e2. And if you have a pretty complete database, you'll see like 8 games with c3, which is what Caruana played. And even after c3, bishop c5, again, just developing, using the pin on this knight to put your bishop on an active square, perhaps hoping to lop off an attacking piece. All of the games continued bishop g3, queen d5, and then this cute move bishop d6, with the idea that bishop d6, knight b5 is possible, discovering an attack on the queen, and also like with this weird triple attack on the bishop. And all of the games have continued queen takes d1, king takes d1, and then bishop e5. It is also possible to just go a takes b5 and allow something like this. I honestly don't know if white is winning or if it's a draw or what in this position. It looks interesting. I mean, very complicated. Maybe a place for future research. It's also possible that because all of the correspondence games have gone bishop e5, that line is not possible for some very deep reason that I can't figure out without like hours in front of my computer. But yeah, all of the games have gone like this, and then there's some split between knight c6 and rook d8 here. It is interesting that there's a game in my database with 22 knight c6 that has Andrei Oleksak, the guy that I beat in 2010, playing this move from the white side instead of from the black side later. So maybe he in some way was like inspired by our game, or maybe he was just super obsessed with the poison pawn in 2010 and he was just playing every game that he could. But yeah, all of the games that have reached this position start with this curious move. But like Caruana, man, I wish that I wasn't at work and I was following the broadcast and I could have seen MVL's face when Caruana played bishop c4. Really weird sort of like line clearing and deflection sacrifice. The queen happens to be very vulnerable in the c4 square to like knight d6 ideas, and also the fact that white obviously is clearing lines to castle and developing as fast as possible is also a relevant point. But yeah, the idea is of course queen takes c4, and then like the only move, it's not necessarily an obvious move, it's just like the only move that actually works once you play bishop c4 is this bishop d6 idea. Of course, with the point that bishop takes d6, knight takes d6 check, forks the king and the rook. And of course, once the bishop slams itself onto d6, black has a hard time castling, and then it becomes very hard to find good moves. For instance, like just obvious developing move, loses instantly to bishop takes c5. Again, knight takes c5, allows knight d6, and you've just hung a piece, and your position hasn't actually gotten any better. So black needs like more concrete ideas here. I looked at a couple. In the game, MVL found maybe the most practical move, which is knight f6, which does shed some material, but also forces the trade of queens in a long and complicated, along a complex way. But there are other moves. The first one is f5, at least has to be considered, basically booting the knight from the e4 square before it can cause any mischief on the d6 square. And knight takes c5, knight takes c5, knight takes f5 exploits this pin along the e-file, and I think Caruana in the press conference said that basically this is just also completely winning for white. Unsurprising. If you move this knight, which is under attack, then white gets to play here, and yeah, that's going to be very terrifying. And it's also possible if we go back, not to bishop d6. Yeah, bishop d6 here. It's also possible to lop this knight off instead. There's some really interesting lines here. It doesn't... I tried to check and see if anyone had actually conclusively figured out what was going on after this move, and I'm glad to say that like I did all of my analysis and I was like, man, I wonder if like anyone on chess.com had figured it out. No one has figured it out. Yeah, so bishop d4, rook d4, queen b3, looking to get kind of naughty on the b1 square. It's possible to just go castles here and like have sort of a generic attack. You're down a piece and 3 pawns still, but you have a huge lead in development, a bunch of open lines, and like tons of threats, of course. And black still can't castle. Like this move is going to be really annoying at some point, but still maybe like pretty unclear. Or after queen b3, you can just go here immediately, and you can allow this check. Actually, if after something like king f2, it's also possible to just go like king d2. These positions are unbelievable. If black gets really greedy and allows you to take here, I think that black's losing. I think you can also take on f8, but bishop c5 I thought was very pretty. I think Stockfish maybe called this a mate in 6 or a mate in 7, something like that. Just getting ready to slam this move down. One pretty idea is knight takes c5, rook d8 with a kind of a pretty. Is this an epaulette mate? I don't know. But anyway, yeah. So those are the other options: bishop d4, f5, which is Caruana said was losing, or the game move knight f6, and of course white sort of is honor bound to take here, and then the point of MVL's play is to go knight d5, which hits c3 and also the queen at the same time. And if white does not want it, like at first glance, queen g3, right? You just hit the g7 pawn, but that allows queen c3 check. So same idea. If white does not want to trade queens, he has to go queen e5, and then MVL just very casually goes rook g8. I guess if you're not castling, you might as well just go rook g8. Pretty amazingly calm move for like how hilarious this constellation of pieces hovering around his king is. I sort of think like white doesn't have much of a choice but to go knight takes e6 here. Because he can't castle himself, you got to kind of keep the momentum going. And I think, for the most part, this line is forced. Just giving up basically some amount of material back again in order to just trade the queens and simplify into this ending. And so we kind of fly through these forced moves here. Rook d3, removing your rook, hitting the knight, and you're hitting this rook on a8 at the same time. And we reach this complicated position where white's regaining some of his material. So he's still down a piece and 2 pawns. Now he regained the one on e6. And he's gaining some amount of material back. And I think, like, the one thing, I don't have the timestamps, but the one thing you have to realize about this game is, like, Caruana had used almost no time up through, like, some absurd move. Like, he was still in book after, like, queen e5 or something. And MVL had burned a tremendous amount of time. And again, I think in this position, MVL sunk into a deep think again, and this was, like, where Caruana started thinking. So I think MVL settled on knight e4, saving the knight instead of the rook. But it's also very reasonable. I think people after the game seem to think that 26 rook a7 was like the first considerable improvement that MVL could have played over the game. And then I think people were insisting that, like Stockfish is saying something like castles, king g6, rook c3, king h7, and then knight d5. And white still has some initiative here. It's not like it's super easy for black. Bishop c5 is coming, and black will probably have to shed like the b6 pawn to organize his pieces, or white's going to slam rook f7 down and then pin the b pawn to the rook or whatever. And it's just this is probably the better way to go, but still not easy. And I can sort of rationalize why maybe MVL thought, okay, just save the knight, let him take the rook, strand the knight on a8 for now, and try and develop. So after rook d3, he goes knight e4. And Caruana plays a very precise, in my opinion, castles. It's also possible to just go knight takes a8, but then after something like this, it might allow king... Let me turn off Stockfish. Yeah, it might allow king e7, whereas in the game, after castles, black's king is forced to g6. And David Howell made a really good point during the broadcast that, like, in positions like this where black's down in exchange but has these A and B pawns, like, the A and B pawns are a lot scarier if black's king were, like, on the queen side. Like, if you took black's king and, okay, if the rook wasn't on d6, obviously, but if you took black's king and you put it, like, on c6, the king is probably more sheltered over by his minor pieces and also by the two pawns, and it's also very much easier for black to start pushing the pawns when his king is there in the ending to support him. Like, when the king is over on h7 and the pawns over there, they're very weak, and as you'll see in the game, they both eventually fall, and then it becomes like a very sad defensive task for MVL. So yeah, Caruana castles first, forcing king g6, and then takes on a8. MVL develops with knight c6, and then Caruana goes back with knight b6. And yeah, it's pretty clear sort of in this position that I think at the very least white is somewhat better. So he's got the exchange for these two pawns, but these two pawns right now are not... It's not like they're on like a5, b5, and they're ready to start marching, or they're kind of creating counterplay. They're just like stagnant, and with how many pawns are missing from the board, like the rook is about as good as you can expect, like the rook versus knight to be, really. So MVL goes rook d8, hitting the bishop, and Caruana goes knight takes c8, both simultaneously protecting the bishop and exchanging off the pieces, and then Caruana saves the bishop with bishop a3. It seems like a lot of people are saying, Stockfish included, not a person, but that rook e1 was more precise here. For instance, knight f6. I don't think that black wants to lose extra time by going here. I'm guessing if he did that, then white would be able to play rook c1 and pin the knight, forcing... yeah, so let's just look at it, actually. So, like, knight takes d6, rook takes d6. Let's just go, like, okay, king f5. And then... Okay, so it just wants to go rook d7, actually. I was wondering about this move. Now, we'll just do it live. Rook c7 first. Okay, I was thinking, like, something like this. In which case, it looks like... white would be able to lop off a bunch of pawns, but okay, so yeah, like rook d7 first, and then b5, rook d5, okay, and then rook c1. So similar idea, but yeah, I think it's safe to say that in a position where black plays knight takes d6, white is going to win both of these pawns, and then you're going to have 2v2 on one side, rook versus knight, which Carlson was saying that 2v2 rook versus knight, almost all of them are winning for white. It's different with a bishop, but with rook versus knight, two pawns, it's very hard to defend it as black, and in most cases theoretically winning. I think he also said if it gets down to one pawn, it's a little bit more complicated. We'll see some of that a little bit later. Okay, so bishop a3, rook c7, stopping rook d7, rook f4, knight f6, bishop b2. Okay, just putting the bishop on a more active diagonal, and as you'll see, threatening possibly to go bishop takes f6. And MVL goes knight e7, bishop takes g6. So white decides to cash in the bishop for fracturing black's pawns on the queen side, possibly with the hopes of, ganging up on the f6 pawn at some point. And Caruana goes h4. And no one after the game seemed to think that h4 was the best move. The reason being that it seems hard to avoid the trade of h-pawns after h4. I'm not sure how far Caruana saw into the line, because you'll see that b7 also drops, so it's not so easy to judge. But it seems like if the h-pawns come off, then it leaves like g-pawn versus f-pawn, which is very hard with one pawn, rook versus knight, to actually win. So, timeout. Talking very fast, and I just needed to jadoob some water into my mouth. Okay, so yeah, Caruana goes h4. Stockfish seems to be obsessed with h3. There are probably 87 other rook moves that are possible, just not h4. And MVL goes h5, stopping the pawn and also stopping like white from gaining more space with g4. I'm guessing part of the idea here is that like the positional threat of like fixing a pawn on h6 would be tough, like g4 h5 check. And so he doesn't allow it. There's also like the off chance that, for instance, like knight f5 and cementing a pawn into f6 would be very, very hard to win for white. Once the knight gets into this square, protects f6, it like, you know, keeps white's king out a bit. That would be very tough. So that white has to sort of act concretely after this. And I'm guessing Caruana, because he's just a monster calculator, saw pretty far here, and saw rook g3, king f5, and now rook g5, exploiting this pin to attack the h5 pawn. It is trickier than it looks, though, actually, because there's, first of all, there's knight g6 here, when you have to kind of see that rook takes h5 is still possible because of this line, picking up this rook. Or even fancier after this, when you think like, okay, this is good, black can also flick in this check, and then forcing rook f1, because of course king takes and then, or king moves and then knight takes f4. So you have to go here. This is obviously completely winning for white, but you have to see this. So rook g5, knight g6 doesn't quite work, but black can also flick in rook c1 before going knight g6, which is what happened in the game. Hitting the rook, you don't have time for this anymore because there's no rook h7, takes h7. Rook h7 check takes c7, excuse me. So you have to move the rook back. Second rank is best. And then this is the problem with h4, is that after h4, h5, both of these pawns have come off. And even if you win both of these, which again is what happens in the game, it's very hard to win f versus g, one pawn on each side. Almost all advantageous endgames for one side get more advantageous the more pawns there are, because your advantage becomes more severe the more pawns you have to like cash in on when you like slowly build up that positional advantage. It's the same thing in like just pawn up rook endings. Like 4 versus 3 rook versus rook on one side is much more winnable than 2 versus 1, which is much harder than 3 versus 2, for instance. So every time you add a set of pawns, it becomes easier. And it's the same thing here. And so, yeah, Caruana, or MVL, again, the knight is threatened. He has to move the knight. And Caruana picks up the b pawn as well. You'll see that it's not so easy to hold on to the a pawn, or at least MVL chose not to. One thing I don't see people mentioning is why not rook c6 in this position. Just keeping the set of rooks on and also not allowing this rook b6 idea. Because once you trade rooks, the a6 pawn definitely comes up. But maybe he was just thinking like, okay, same thing happens with this kind of idea. I don't know. But so after rook takes b7, MVL goes here. With this, rook b6, rook c6, takes, king g3, king f7, rook c2, bonking the knight, knight b4, rook d2. There's some jockeying for position here. Just white obviously is going to bring his king towards the center. Black's king is going to hover around this f6 pawn. Rook d6, knight e5, rook a6. So then we get to like this like extreme technical phase here. You can engage the Lee chess table bases. So this study will be available. You can load up this and you can play through this ending and try and understand what the hell's going on here. I've tried to do my best. The key idea here seems to be that white is going to slowly maneuver his pieces around using the threat to the f pawn and also the threat of invading on either the h5 square or the e6 square. to make progress, and black's going to try and use the knight to stop him from doing that. Okay, so like you can see very naturally that if black leaves his pawn on f6, these two squares are never going to be available. And you can see if the king is not forced from g6, that these two squares are never going to be available. So like white can try and get around to e6 to make progress, or he can try and maneuver around with the rook such that h5 becomes possible, like king g4 h5, or like some tactics involving g4 g5, exploiting the pin either in this direction or this direction to make progress. You'll see in the game that it appears as though putting the knight on this square is the defensive structure that black needs, which makes a lot of sense because a knight here protects this square and this square, the pawn protects this square and this square. Actually, the knight guards all three of these squares, right? And the pawn guards these two squares. So this fortress with the knight on g7 is quite difficult to break down. There are times where both players lapse in and out, and white allowed black to go back onto the circuit where knight g7 was possible, and there are times when MVL lapsed out where he moved his knight to a square where putting it on g7 was no longer possible. But it didn't seem like in general he was a super large fan of the idea of putting the knight on g7, and so it is what it is. But it actually, even with the knight on the inferior circuit, it is remarkably hard to understand what the heck's going on. So I'll try and elaborate a little bit where I can. Again, there's some shuffling around here, like knight f7, king e4, knight h6, rook a5, knight f7, rook a3, knight d6, king f4, knight f5, rook d3, and then MVL goes knight h6, which turns out to be a fatal error. And of course, it's no surprise after my long diatribe on this ending that knight g7 was better. But the combination of knight h6 along with the fact that black's king is budged from h5 and f5 causes black some problems. But even now, it's not that easy to exploit. White has to shuffle around a little bit. So knight e4, king g8, king f5. I think it's also possible to win with a rook a3. And I'll just play out some lines just to kind of show a little bit about like some of the winning configurations. So like let's just say king g6, rook b3. White's just moving. White in some of these positions, like white plays like rook a3, rook b3, and he like triangulates a little bit with the king to set up this winning structure where basically what white needs to do is play king g4 in a position where he needs the rook on g3, the king on g4, and he needs to be able to, when black resists him getting into h5 with king g6, just like this position, okay, he needs to be able to go king h4 check with the knight on g8. Okay, and the reason, I'll just show you. This is just getting ridiculous, isn't it? Okay, so okay, let's just go knight e7 here, for instance. And then another key move is white needs to go rook b5 here. I think this is, yeah, table base confirms this is the only winning move. Reason being is that you need to dominate the knight out of the f5 square, because if you allow knight f5 back to g7, it's a draw again. So white has to take time out, go rook b5 to not allow, once the knight is on e7, to not allow knight g7. Okay, so he goes back, king d5, king f7. Black also cannot allow the king into e6. Rook b7, king g6, king e6, knight h6, rook b8, king g4. So this is like one option where white gets into e6 instead. This is maybe a little bit more straightforward. Basically, the f6 pawn falls. You just budge the knight away from g4, and unfortunately for black, the rook on g7 covers the g pawn, and white gets in. But again, rook a3, it's also possible after king g6, rook b3 for... instead of knight e7, rook b5, you can just go king f7. And then we see kind of the other idea, which is king f4. So white heads over towards h5. Knight h6. Again, black is resisting white getting in. Rook g3. Both kind of waiting for a second and stopping black's king from coming to the g6 square. This would be annoying, at least for a second. And the point is this is exactly the right time for white to do this, because the only real move here is knight g8. And now, perfect timing. And you'll see king g6 in this case allows king h4 check when king h6 is not possible because of this discovered check, like because of this x-ray of the knight on g8. Like if this knight was on e7, he would be able to go king h6 and stop you from getting into h5. But in this specific configuration of pieces, white's timed it exactly perfectly so that he would have to go king h7 or king f7, one of these two squares, and then white gets into h5. And we'll see a little bit later why that's actually significant. But okay, rook a3, another win. Just the first time I can show you guys like how this ending is won. Okay, so let's roll it back a little bit just so we know where the heck we are. So rook d3 and then knight h6, this mistake, because it should go to g7. Rook g3 check, king f7, king e4, rook, knight g8, king f5, knight e7, king f4. So again, there's like this noodling around. It's also possible to go king e4, and then there are similar lines to before. I have knight g8, rook a3, king g6, rook b3. Again, this shuffling around, king e7 or knight e7. Again, rook b5, key move, not allowing knight f5 to g7. Put that in red because it's a threat. King f7, rook b7, king e6, sort of forced, king f4, knight d5 check, king g4, and then white's getting in. Okay, so knight e7 check, king f4 instead of king e4, which I just showed, knight d5. And then Caruana actually breaks now and goes king g4, which allows king g6, knight f3, king f3, king f7, and now on king e4, MVL, like both players clearly don't understand the significance of this knight g7 idea. I only know it because I've watched like the analysis between Howell and Carlson, and seen some other people's analysis and press conference, and now done my own analysis with table bases. I only know now that knight c7 is the correct move because it allows black to get back on this circuit to lock in this knight g7 fortress. But yeah, so in this position, MVL goes knight e7, blunders back, and then we're back on the same sort of thing as before. This time, instead of going knight f4, he goes instead of going king e4, king f4. I'll get it, I promise. It's been a long day. Caruana goes king e4, and then he kind of figures it out here at some point. So again, some posturing here. King f4, knight h6, rook g3, knight g8, and he's there. So same position as before, king g4. Again, if he goes king g6, king h4, knight f7, king h5 would be winning. Just one sample line just so you can kind of see like what's going on here, why this is bad. Eventually the g-pawn gets involved, and then it becomes very hard to stop all of the threats. King gets into g6, and once the king gets into g6, it's very hard to stop the loss of the pawn. Even in this position, just the line I showed allows this simple simplification to a winning pawn ending. So back to the game, rook g3, knight g8, king g4. Again, this configuration where this is winning because of this. King h5, knight d5, rook f3, king e6, g4, And again, if like trying to keep the king out of g6 with this would very easily allow the win with this, where either the pawn hits g6 or obviously a threat here would be something like g takes f6, knight takes f6, king g5, winning with the pin. That sort of thing is also winning. So after g4, there's king e5, and then after king g6, yeah, I don't think you can hold it all together. MVL resigned at this point, but just to take a look at it maybe real quick. Knight f4 makes a lot of sense. I would probably go king g7. And if black tries to free himself, f5 allows g5. Knight f6. I guess you maybe have to go to h6, and then on knight f4, where's the win? Here. Yeah, okay, and then king g7. Yeah, so there's also these ideas of rook e1 separating the king from the g-pawn, in which you can't really keep it all together. I would probably just play rook e6 here and call it a day. You're going to play here and you're winning, so yeah, man, quite the game. I hope you guys liked it. Again, I would encourage everyone to load up this study, hop into the table bases, use Stockfish, analyze it for yourself. It's really a fascinating game. I watched this game live as much as I could from work because I'm responsible. And then right when I got home, I ordered some takeout sushi and I started diving into this thing. And it's just 10 p.m. now, and I'm really not sick of it. It was a beautiful game. I mean, there's a lot. You can get lost even just in the opening, like trying to analyze all of these wild ideas after bishop c4. I mean, correspondence players and top grandmasters are going to be chewing on this novelty for a long time. I guess Kasim Janov had it ready for uncorking for quite a few months now, and they were saving it. And man, what a beauty! Like c3, c3, and bishop c5. Bishop g3, queen d5, bishop c4. Jeez. Yeah, really nice. And again, I didn't show all of the analysis in the file, and I didn't show all of the background analysis on a lot of the other possibilities in the poison pawn variation. Really interesting stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope this video was helpful. And yeah, like the video. Subscribe to my channel, post a comment, say hi. I got all the, I'd like to hear from all the usual suspects. Yeah, have a good night. See you guys hopefully for another round. Peace.